You have entered the 21st century dystopian portal. Welcome to confusion. Welcome to question. And welcome to clarity. The life is in the blood.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the 21 CD podcast. You guys are like right here. My computer's like right up here. So if I'm not looking into your soul the entire time, it's because of that. But if I do look into your soul, say thank you. Hit that little bell if you like us on YouTube. Hit that 5-star if you like us on Spotify. I guess those are the only ways to be included in the algorithmic benefits these days. But don't forget to subscribe and follow and like and do any of those other things you would typically do for people that you enjoy hearing from. Let's get a move on. What once was, as it was in Genesis, isn't really any longer, right? We can no longer fathom what life once looked like. The sizes of the creatures that were here, that were here back then, that existed in the ancient past, and even the types of beings that were on the earth in those days, we just don't really know. Beyond what we see from the Ark, beyond that, we don't really know what else there was. And we dig up these bones, these dinosaur bones, these mammoth bones, all these bones. We dig them all up and we name them things, just like the Irish elk, you know, and whatever we find in the ocean. And we do all of these things and we create animals, okay? But without an actual living specimen or a full body or something, we can really only compare them to what there is today on Earth. So, that being said, a lot of these bones could be literally anything. I'm going to be talking about some bones today. I talked about some bones on Monday when we were talking about the existential elk, which is maybe actually Nephilim livestock, or maybe a Nephilim himself. That's what they believed it was back in the day. So I'm going to be talking about some bones and some ancient histories today. And I just feel like it's really important because we're also going to be talking about giants and Nephilim. And I feel like it's really important to remember that if they lie to us in Hollywood, if they lie to us on the radio, on the TV, on the internet, and they censor all the people who say weird stuff for some reason and all that kind of stuff, they are hiding something. So when did the hiding really begin? It wasn't in 2000. It was probably way before then. It wasn't 2025. They started doing this thousands of years ago, hiding the reality of God, hiding the truth, right? And so, if we just believe them, we're just a bunch of gullible sheep. But we don't actually know what we don't know. We only know, and we can only fathom what they have given us to know and fathom. Anything else comes directly from the Holy Spirit, right? Okay. And I imagine that God feels a great pain, honestly, when a species that goes extinct. But what if that species was never meant to be here at all? Would he feel pain then? What if they were products of experiments performed by early man with watcher technology, or by Nephilim, or by watchers? The Watchers being those fallen angels that came with the ways and powers and technology of gods, the fallen angels who descended on Mount Hermon and mated with human women and created Nephilim, the giants. Are you following me? I came to the understanding when attempting to fight the powers that be, you know, those that would hide the secrets from us, that this was not a fight worth dying for. Like, trying to get them out of office and trying to do all that kind of stuff. I've seen the other side. I've been a government worker. I've seen what they are hiding in part. I was once a part of it myself in ways that I can't really talk about. I was an investor in it, an employee of the beast system, you could call me. And up until recently, I still offered services to such entities in a capacity. The white collars and the dark suits in the big houses, surrounded by electricity and razor wire, have chosen to enslave themselves first, though, and cut themselves off from the old knowledge and the old history, or to keep it secret. Regardless, they come for us now. So, to the woods I would go, and in the woods I hope to die, to be honest. Me and those who would come with me. No, I'm not starting a cult like my dad. I'm just using words, people. But if you are like me, you have a soul that hungers for the stories from the lost times. And believe it or not, I am an ordained reverend, but the fascinating and the mysterious stories of that great beyond also flow forth from me. And if there's one thing I've learned of the Almighty, it is that he deeply loves his mysteries. So, let's go swimming in the abyss of these legends and the lore that they would kill from us into the mysteries that they would take from the heavens, from us, from God, and away from the distractions that they would replace them with. Because it's lame. Netflix sucks compared to what God's got in store for us. Now, when early Christian monks and scholars in Ireland unearthed those enormous antlers of the existential elk, the Irish elk that I talked about on Monday, like we said then, they didn't really see an extinct species. They saw remnants of the flood, a creature that had literally died in the flood. And the medieval annals and commentaries record all sorts of weird types and naturalists that, puzzled over these skulls, and they called them things like ossa gigantum, which means bones of the giants. And some even linked those bones to the Nephilim themselves, the hybrid offspring of angels and humans from the book of Genesis. Genesis 6:4 says that there were giants in the earth in those days. And the scale seemed to fit the story. Creatures so mighty that only divine wrath could have swept them away. There was no way that whatever had this massive skull with these huge antlers, with these huge horns, there was no way that that was a natural creature, they thought. And honestly, if it was your first time seeing it, you might say the same thing. But they might have actually been right too. Like, we're quick to say, oh no, they over-evolved. If you're a Darwinist, which is just a fancy way of saying if you're a retard. But if you're not, you can and you believe in spiritual things, and you believe you've seen spiritual things, and your soul is hungry, and your mind is not completely crowded with mathematical equations and accidents and how the world was created and all of that good stuff, you can kind of see how these types of creatures are mentioned in ancient scripts. They are mentioned throughout history, and it's us that just decided to stop believing in them eventually, right? I'm sorry if I'm yelling a little bit too loud. I might have turned my mic up too much. I'm not sure. But, so we have these people linking these ancient discoverers of these gigantic elk horns that were 13 feet apart, and they're saying, these are the skulls of Nephilim, and these pastors and these priests and these bishops and all of these people would smuggle them away and hide them so that their evil didn't leak out of them. And the oral traditions just grew from this interpretation. In some counties, the elk was reimagined as the great stag of the deluge, a creature that tried to climb the highest hills of Ireland as the flood waters rose, only for its antlers to get caught in the trees and then drown it. And even today, tales in Galway and Mayo, when that stag can be heard bellowing in the fog still, and it's the echo of that drowned ancestor essentially calling it from beneath the ground. crazy stories like this that exist throughout time, and you've got to ask yourself why. Science didn't exist throughout time. We had to create that. But these things seem to exist inherently as long as mankind has been here. Isn't that kind of strange? I know, and people go, oh, we didn't have the tech, we didn't have the knowledge. Why? Were we just so stupid for thousands of years that we didn't understand science? I don't know, and I'm not saying that all science is bad. Obviously, science is good in a great many ways and in a great many places. But when you try to explain the origin of life, I think it falls very short. And I would rather believe in a world that aligns with what my God believes, I guess, what people throughout time have expressed. In Irish myth, the Tuatha De Danann, which were pre-Christian gods of Ireland, were said to retreat underground, becoming the people of the mounds. And if you put that against the backdrop of a flood, maybe they did try to escape, or maybe they are demonic entities, which of course they are if they're false gods, and they just chose to live beneath the ground, giving rise to this underworld concept. But among them was somebody that I'm sure you will recognize the name of, Cernunnos. And he was some kind of horned god, sometimes equated with Dawn, the Lord of the Dead, spelt D-O-N-N. And ancient Irish stone carvings and bronze statuettes depict this god, and he was antlered like a gigantic elk. He was this deity that was constantly surrounded by stags and snakes and serpents, the same animals that are often tied to cycles of death and rebirth. I just found it so interesting how many ancient people actually saw this elk as a bad sign instead of a good one. Like, we just say, oh, it's just an elk. And I even said it before I released the show. I was like, dude, I hope people don't just get bored because I'm talking about a freaking deer. But the people of old didn't seem to see this as a good thing. They saw this as a monster, as a beast that would come for them eventually. And when the fossilized antlers of the Irish elk were found, they were sometimes, like I said before, displayed in chapels or great houses beside the very depictions, the idols of Cernunnos. So this all merged into this kind of folk motif that these skulls were the remains of the horned ones, the physical trace of the gods who once walked openly on the surface of the earth. Can you imagine? But just like we sometimes say that like dinosaurs are actually giant bones, like dinosaur bones, like sure, there were dragons in the earth and they are also what we call dinosaurs. And some of these great bird reptile type species I'm sure existed as well. But at the root of it, we are led to believe they are millions upon billions upon trillions upon gajillions upon a million of unmade words in unfathomable times. That basically we might as well just believe them as they say, trust me, bro, the dinosaurs. But we don't actually know because none of us have ever seen one. And there's very little actually recording dinosaurs when you look throughout history. There's some weird stuff, but not a lot. And so that makes me think that maybe there weren't as many as they say that there were, and that some of them may have been other creatures like dragons, giants, and these types of things that are mentioned in biblical and other religious texts. And so can you imagine these gigantic antlered Nephilim walking the planet? And I'm not saying that the elk couldn't have been bigger back then either. I'm just saying, wow. Like, it would be crazy if they were actually Nephilim. So you want to walk the line, if you will, between myth and history. And you want to kind of not lose your way in the myth, but also remember the history. Before the first cathedral was even built, before the Latin tongue even reached the Western Isles, the people of the forests already believed in something. They had some kind of god. And they weren't gods of light and sky, but gods that breathed beneath the ground's surface, beneath the peat and beneath the moss. And they called them by many names. Cernunnos, Cernunnos, the antlered one. And he didn't really have a throne. He just sat there, cross-legged in the soil. Antlers, hung with ivy and moss and leaves and surrounded by all the beasts of the field. They trusted him. They were of him, essentially. And his face first appears on the Pillar of Boatmen, which was found, coincidentally, under Notre Dame in Paris. And it was carved by these Gaulish stone masons sometime around 50 AD. And above the inscription, Dio Cernunno, or Deo Cernunno, which of course means God. Deo means God. And he's got these horns. And he's wearing this sort of torque of kings. And the Romans thought that this was just some rustic, barbaric god. But among the tribes of the Sicani, the Carnutes, and the Parisi, he was literally the bridge between life and the underworld. He was a god to them. And the Druids whispered that when men took too much from the earth in some way, Cernunnos would make himself known. And when the rivers turned red with blood, whether from war or from the hunt, his shadow would grow across the land. And the first clash came when Caesar's legions marched into Gaul. He wrote that the Celts were addicted to superstition. Their groves were thick with idols and their sacrifices that appeared without reason throughout this forest that they would go through. But there is a story left out of the official commentaries that has sort of been passed down in fragments by these types like me, monastic copyists, stuff like that. In 53 BC, during Caesar's winter campaign in the Ardennes, a detachment of soldiers actually disappeared. There's some movies about this. I think one is called Centurion. It has somebody weird in it, like Channing Tatum or something. I'll have to double check that. But they found the camp weeks later, the camp of this detachment. All the fires had burned out, all the food had been left uneaten, and the soldiers were arranged in a circle. All of them were missing their eyes, and the local guides refused to even enter that place. They said that the men had trespassed into the gods' wood. One centurion wrote in his diary, "They worship not a man, but a stag that walks like one." Now, when Rome absorbed Gaul, Cernunnos was essentially just painted over. Like we've talked about from time and time again, we've spoken about how the victor gets to tell the story. The victor determines history and whether or not some things that happened should actually be presented to the future as things that happen, or if they should just be glossed over, painted over. And Cernunnos was one of those things that was simply buried. And all of his shrines became basilicas, his torque became the halo, his holidays became whatever they are, and his horns became the mark of the devil. This is kind of how the Catholic Church painted holidays and painted evil and painted good things. A lot of it was erasing things that already existed so that those followers had something else to grasp onto in Catholicism, or so that Catholicism could essentially consume these rival religions and these pagan beliefs. And by the 3rd century, under Emperor Constantine, open worship of these old gods was punishable by death. But the rural folk, the pagans, the country people, continued doing it. They continued those rites in secret. And you'll recognize some of the names because at Samhain and Imbolc, they left offerings at old stones or beneath oak roots where they believed that the horned ones slept. And monks from Tours wrote bitterly of the demon of the wildwood, who would come out and tempt farmers with promises of fertility and game. This was a problem both physically but also spiritually, because a rival god was taking their flock. But travelers in the Burgundy forest continued to speak of glowing eyes that would watch from the dark, and of deer that would not die, even after being pierced through the heart. By the 8th century, what little we know of Cernunnos survived basically only in the margins of texts, in findings that came later, and in stories that were kind of forbidden to tell and smuggled somehow through time and space to where we are now. Fast forward to 1012, under the reign of King Robert II of France, the Pious, a decree banned all forest processions and pagan effigies. Yet again, reports from Ardennes and across the land told tales of midnight gatherings, peasants dancing in circles of fire, men wearing stag skulls, women chanting in strange tongues. And a chronicler from Liege described one such suppression, saying, "We entered the grove and found them about a great trunk, carving upon it the likeness of a horned man." When Christianity swept fully through Europe, Cernunnos, you would think, should have vanished. But we, to this day, have echoes of him that persist. In the Norse elk gods that we talked about on Monday, the Jotun, the Finnish Tapio, the Scottish Green Man, in Herne of Windsor, archaeologists have traced the migration of Cernunnos, the symbol itself, antlers, torque, serpent, from the Gundestrup cauldron in Jutland to the carvings of Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. It's pretty incredible how this being appears to have survived. And in each retelling, the Horned One becomes less divine, more ghost, the huntsman, doomed to roam the forest with the souls of the dead. But there's a darker suggestion among folklorists that the whole wild hunt myth was born not from religion, but from actual memory, the people remembering what they saw. By the 18th century, Europe was totally illuminated by reason. And this is when we talked about how they began to make everything fit within the frame of Darwinism and evolution. And they totally eradicated the concept of giants. They got rid of all of the ideas that these beings in the ground could be gods or Nephilim or demons or dragons, anything like that. And superstition kind of waned out. But the stories, of course, are continuing to be told. Now, there's lots of stories that some say are unverified, some say are simply journal entries that could mean nothing at all. I take all of these stories with a grain of salt, and I encourage everybody to do that all the time. Don't just believe everything you hear or see on the internet. But I have read stories of many people who claim to see something like Cernunnos, the Green Man, Cernunnos himself, a stag being in the woods. Just look at the Wendigo or the Skinwalker. There's all sorts of tales of them having antlers in various capacities. And it's just, you gotta give it a little bit of credit, in my opinion. And in 1948, when the peat cutters in Denmark were starting to unearth things, and one of those things was that famous cauldron, that revived interest in Cernunnos. They had silver panels miraculously preserved depicting rituals, and one panel showed the horned god surrounded by deer and men holding spears, but there was no sign of violence. Another showed antlered beings kind of merging with the trees, as the Irish elk was said to do. That same year, a French ethnographer, Jean-Jacques Hot, found small stone heads in the Vosges depicting men with stag horns. He noted tool marks showing deliberate decapitations, as though to prevent awakening. And by the 1970s, all of these Wiccan and neo-pagan groups resurrected Cernunnos as a sort of deity of nature and fertility. He began to appear in entertainment and movies and shows. But some locals still refuse to speak about him. They still left milk by the stones. Not for him, they said, but so he passes by, so he leaves us be. If you strip away all the theology around the horned god, one of the oldest questions that humanity has ever faced surfaces. What happens if we try to destroy nature? What happens if we try to cut down every tree on the planet? If we try to render every species extinct? Is it even possible? Or will the earth rise up? Will certain beings come out of it to ensure that we fail in this mission? And that's why I sort of say we don't really know the purpose of every creature. We don't really know the purpose of every cryptid, but some might exist for a very specific purpose, and it's essentially pagans and non-believers that turn this entity into a god of their own. But in actuality, it's a cryptid. It's a species. I'm not saying that they aren't also sometimes false gods. Absolutely I am. But I'm also saying that even the ancient Israelites worshipped a cow who didn't have any special abilities. They just worshipped a cow. It was just an animal. And there may be cryptids out there that underwent the same thing. We don't curse cows when we drive past them because they are false deities. But, you know, if we saw a statue of Cernunnos, we might. Christians might spit in the general direction of a false god. But what if that's a cryptid? What if it's just a species of being that sort of entered reality, is in our reality, that the ancient pagans started worshiping? Meanwhile, his whole mission was just to ensure that nature survived in a time that was very rough. I don't know. I'm just speaking out loud here. I'm just thinking out loud. But historians say that Cernunnos cult died out by the 4th century. I don't know about that. I've seen his image carved in a 19th century farmhouse beams all over the place. I've read all these records in journals, the unexplained deaths, the things that happen deep in the woods, and we continue to make entertainment about these things. So whether he is a god, some kind of cryptid species, just an animal, if you will, a spiritual being, some sort of survivor of the flood in some way, Cernunnos might be something more than we give it credit for. Some versions even describe these horned ones and Cernunnos as messengers between worlds, kind of guardians of the forest passageways between the humans and the other world. When Christianity took hold, that just couldn't be, right? The horned figure was reinterpreted as demonic. Maybe it was. It was reinterpreted that way regardless, giving birth to the archetype of the devil with antlers. So in a strange way, the Irish elk we're finding is both a divine kind of relic that we would put in a museum and a demon seed. There's a lot of Irish elk remains found in the Irish peat bogs, as we already said, and that too is a place that is long to believe sort of a portal to the underworld. People would often offer weapons and jewelry and even human sacrifices to the swamp, to the bog, thinking that it would lead to the underworld. And when massive antlers started to emerge from those same places, to them it was confirmation that something ancient was below. A legend from one of these old counties tells of a hunter who found a skull with antlers the size of a yew tree, and he took it home to mount on his wall. And that night, his hounds would howl until dawn, all night long, and in the morning he found hoof prints that were circling his cottage, as if pressed by something heavy, very heavy. And by evening, the antler, he said, had vanished, leaving only the smell of earth. Do what you will with that, but locals said that the hunter had disturbed a sleeping god of the fen. And this tale still circulates under variations like the stag beneath the peat or the horns of the hollow hill, motifs of resurrection, if you will, retribution of types, and the idea that these creatures weren't really dead. They were just sort of waiting, as the old Irish would say, till the third dawning of the age or whatever. And if we take it a step further into myth, in Celtic and Arthurian legend, The white stag is a herald of transformation, often signaling that one has entered the other world. There's a lesser known oral prophecy with some kind of Celtic imagery to it that says that when the horns of the earth rise again from the mire, the horned king shall walk once more. We mentioned the horned king on Monday. And some Irish folklorists do believe this saying emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries when massive elk skeletons were being dug up and displayed in Dublin's Natural History Museum, okay? And the prophecy reflects that. If such ancient beasts can come up from the bog, what else is going to come up in the end? I also believe some creatures have not served their purpose just yet, or they do so invisibly. We have no concept of some of the beings yet. Like I said in the beginning, we have no clue what's real, what's fake. We don't know what we don't know. And if there's anything that I've been finding out lately, it's that the powers that be are trying to eliminate our concept of God. And not just God, but gods in general. They're trying to eliminate the concept of spirituality, of being spiritual, of having a God. They're trying to eliminate all of that in such a way that it feels forced. Like they're doing it as fast as possible, getting the memory of God away, changing the memory of God like the Catholic Church did in the old days. All these new churches that are just taking Christianity and making it their own thing. And you see a world that would almost rather not believe in anything than this. And to me, instead of believing that's because science is getting stronger, I think that they're trying to kill the idea that we are more, that we are capable of spiritual abilities, and that spiritual beings do exist, and that there is a God, and there is a spiritual war taking place. Like, I think they are literally trying to hide that, and that's why I call science magic, and that's why scientists are so often magicians. Like, I'm sorry, but the guy, Fauci, you're no scientist, bro. You're no doctor. You are an evil warlock. You are a terrible, evil magician who cast your magic all over this planet and killed everybody. So I think that there are certain things that are impossible to occur, destructions that are of impossible levels to achieve, as brought about by human hands. And cryptids, spiritual beings we don't always see with cameras, but can see with our eyes, or our spirits, or our souls, they will step in to ensure that whatever is about to take place does not, because it's not supposed to. That is an impossibility attempted to be brought about by humanity. I don't know if I'm making any sense here, but I really hope I am, because I think it's an important point. And it's important to remember that in the past, mankind had enemies of magical abilities too. You had all sorts of magicians and wizards and witches that courts would use to try to bring about certain results. And then you had the pagans, and you had all these kinds of sacrifices and rituals. Magic has always existed. We still have those things today, but they mask themselves in music, in entertainment. All the tricks that magicians have always used. It's just more computer oriented now. And we also don't see a lot of things as magic that in the past they would call magic. Some of these beings that possess these abilities were the Nephilim. There are many, many different types of people. There appear to have been also many, many different types of Nephilim. Giants, half spirit, half man entities, part animal entities, part entities that don't even exist, not always simply half man, but sometimes half beast, half something else. They are also said to have manufactured all types of monsters. They sinned against all flesh in those days. There could be anything of any type of description that we have no knowledge of. And some that we do, like, what the hell is the platypus? I'm just kidding. I don't know, but it's a weird one. You gotta give me Give me that, right? It is a weird one. At least give me that. And that brings me to another type of creature that I wanted to talk about, which now in hindsight feels like I'm kind of drifting off topic, but I had a reason for talking about it. I think it was just because it sounded cool, but these ice giants, because I came across a strange article about human hibernation, and I'm going to read it to you now. It's kind of long, but It's very interesting, and it has something to do, I don't know how, but it feels like it has something to do with these ancient beings from the old days that we are led to believe never existed. And so I'm going to read you this article as quickly and understandably as I can. From beyond the grave came startling confirmation of this phenomenon. The phenomenon of human hibernation. The clipping, which is contained in an old scrapbook owned by Elbert S. Stevens of Bridgewater Corners, describes the adventures of an unnamed traveler who inadvertently became the witness of an operation, as he described it, in which half a dozen members of the snowbound hamlet submitted to being drugged and rendered unconscious, and then had their bodies frozen in the piercingly cold winter air before their rude shacks. Shaken to the roots of his soul, this traveler watched the non-committal inhabitants of the village prepare their bodies for a winter interment of more than 4 months. The men and the women in the settlement, working without visible show of emotion, laid the bodies in a rude wooden box, covering them with cloth and boughs of trees, and laid them under a ledge where they were covered shortly after with drifts of snow which were 20 feet deep before the winter was out. He was assured by the women that the bodies would be revived, that they would again become living men and women the following spring, and that this procedure had been followed in the village for years. They told him that the settlement was unable to support itself entirely during the winter, and that these persons were needed for spring planting. Wives thus bade farewell to their husbands regularly every year, and the mothers kissed their sons one last time before they took the drug, which would prepare them for freezing and burial under the ledge. Now, the story's pretty long. I will include the article in the video. And, I'll upload it to like the Patreon and the Substack and stuff. But in the end, 4 months later, after these beings had been covered in snow, they had been left out in this cold, brutal, harsh winter, at risk of cracking in half if they weren't put in special boxes. That's how frigid they were, how frozen solid they were. After a bowl of soup and a hot shower, they came back to life. And there's a couple interesting details here. Some people say, well, it was a practice, an alleged practice in the old days to hibernate the old and the sick because we didn't have enough resources for them, and if they were going to die anyway, we were at least going to try to hibernate them instead of starve them. Weird stuff like that I've heard of, as if this isn't weird too. But they don't say that these beings were sick. They say that they were needed for spring planting, which means they were healthy and strong because they were needed for spring planting, for labor, for work. This doesn't seem possible with the human body. Yeah, I'm just saying, it doesn't seem like this is something that humans can do. There are stories of people from this time being able to do it for a few days, allegedly, and I don't know exactly the science of cryogenics or whatever it's called very well. I know that the Disney being frozen story is allegedly a myth and that it's not real and that we don't have that technology or even know if the human body can go through it. I also know that Elon Musk is attempting to crack the code because he thinks that's how he's going to get to Mars. So, it's really up in the air, I guess, if this is even possible. But if the story is true and it's not possible, that means that these were probably Nephilim, probably some kind of creature that is not from Earth or is not widely known to be on Earth. And that got me thinking about all of the other ice entities and how deeply rooted in American history these concepts of Nephilim are. We have a lot of Nephilim stories in North America that are really kind of hard to explain. But when you take into account stories like this and all of the articles that can be found, I mean, you guys have probably mostly looked at them before, but all of these articles that can be found about giant bones being unearthed and mounds and all of that kind of stuff, it's like there was something very spiritual and supernatural going on in North America during this time. But not just ice giants, there's also antler giants in North America. There were tales in native tongues, stories of the tall ones who froze themselves upright, watching the thresholds of the world. In Cree, Dene, and Inuit oral tradition, these beings are sometimes called the Anaktuk, those who stand frozen, giants made of clear skin, like ice. And these things aren't depicted as predators, guys. They're like sentinels, frozen guardians posted at glacier mouths and frozen rivers and etc. And you could say, well, maybe they're just ice formations. Yeah, maybe they are. Maybe they're not. Maybe we can't see because we don't look, because we have an explanation for everything already. And then we've already discussed the stories of the Wendigo, which I know a lot of people say, well, the Wendigo doesn't actually have antlers, and that might be true, but he is still, in my opinion, a being with a heart of ice, a demon, essentially, and we often refer to Nephilim as demons, especially after they die. Is it possible that this Wendigo is one of those creatures? He is an ice giant. He's an ice demon who comes at certain times. And that's why Wendigo psychosis is very interesting. And all of these types of stories where family men go feral in the middle of winters and eat their families or kill their families, and then they have no recollection of why they did it at all. So what point am I trying to make with all this stuff today? Like, what are we even talking about, really? I know this is a little bit of a crazy episode. Say it's because it's my first Wednesday episode back, and I had to fiddle around with everything and I wasn't really prepared, but as usual. But I think that we need to focus on something specific. And that is the concept that the Nephilim are probably responsible for everything. So when you hear the Nephilim and the demons, the Watchers, like they're probably responsible for all of this stuff. And we might have 1,000 stories from around the world, but they all point to the one thing. There are false gods. There are false deities, and some appear to have antlers, right? And so when they dig these things up, and they find them in the ancient past, and they say, these are not good things. We should look at that and compare it to what they say today, which are, these are just deer. Because maybe they're just deer, maybe they're not. Maybe you can't believe the explanation for every bone that comes out of the earth, even if it appears. Because remember, hybrids are still going to look like they are part this, part that, part something else. And so if you have something that appears to be a hybrid, but it doesn't make any sense, so it must just be a massive version of this, you might actually be looking at the bones of a spiritual entity, if such a thing is even possible. And when we read these articles that are coming out in newspapers in the 30s, in the late 1800s, talking about giants, about hibernation, about inner earth conspiracies, and about, that kind of thing. And then they're quickly snuffed out, and there's no more stories like that in the newspapers today. And people are always just like trying to say like, oh, well, it's because that was a big thing back then. Why is it not still a big thing? The newspapers still exist. Why are people still not talking about giant bones? Why are people still not out here talking about discovering a camp of people who are hibernating their humans, allegedly, until 4 months later, until the winter is over. These sound like deities. These sound like beings they regard as deities. These sound like entities that are not normal humans. Like maybe hybrids, descendants of angels, descendants of these watchers, Nephilim. And then you have Cernunnos, the horned god, who appears to have a skeleton very similar to that of the Irish elk that is pulled out of the bogs that the ancients used to call a Nephilim. And that the ancient pagans, the Gauls, regarded as a god. We regard it as a simple deer. Something to think about. The perspective needs to change. The concept of what could be real needs to change before we can get to the point of actually believing it. And listen, you guys know me. I'm a speculator. I speak what I think. I just have almost no filter. And so I just say stuff constantly. And these are thoughts that I've had recently, especially as I've been in the woods again a lot more. There are just things that are unexplainable, I've come to remember, that are out there, that they say they've explained, things in nature that they have not explained, that they have lied to us about. And I think this is one of those things. Anyway, don't drink the water, question everything. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Thank you for being here. The life is in the blood.